snow survey that was taken 2 weeks ago, admittedly before the storm, although the storm really didn't dent it dramatically, shows that we're at 12% of normal for the snowpack this year. We are at 7% of what we would need for normal on April 1st, which is the highest snowfall of the year in an average year. 25 out of 38 million Californians get their water as it originates in the Sierra and flows through the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta into some distribution system somewhere in the state. The flows are so low that they were never contemplated by the existing law, allocation formulas, by the systems we have to transport water, and we run the risk if we don't have some measure of rainfall in the rest of the season of having real difficulty keeping salt in the San Francisco Bay and not having it move into the Delta. When it moves into the Delta, there's farmers in the Delta. There's water intakes for the city of Antioch, Contra Costa County Water District, as well as the state. There are a whole host of issues. There's a list of communities that could well run out of water in 60 to 100 days that exist. Interestingly, some of them are, people are going on and off the list based on emergency arrangements or recalibration or dramatic conservation measures. But Willits is one that looks like it's in big trouble. 60 days from now, if there's not substantial extra water, they could theoretically go dry as a water system. And for the first time in 54 years of the state water project, we have a 0% allocation. We are projecting to give 0% to the people that rely on the California Water Project, and which includes this area. And this is just where we are now. This turns out to be the third of a 5-year dry period. We haven't begun to see the problems that we're going to have. And it's interesting to explain it, try to explain it colloquially, because there's been a big political fracas going on about this the last couple of weeks. It's a very disorienting experience to watch C-SPAN and see yourself quoted regularly on the House floor. But I was quoted because there's some members of Congress in the San Joaquin Valley that said, this is farms versus fish. And my quote kept being thrown back at them, saying, they're arguing about how to split water. We have no water. There's no reason to talk about splitting what we don't have differently. And to see what that's going to be like. He's rumored to be going to a farm to see firsthand what the impact of the drought is. And so, in many ways, that is the backdrop to a discussion about sustainability and resilience in the system. It's interesting, if you look historically, when Europeans arrived in California, there were 250,000 people living in the current boundaries of California on the water that was available. That was the extent of the water system. We've added 37.7 million people since then, and a water system that has just grown over time, not because it's the natural order of the way to collect, clean, and distribute water in California, but as the growth patterns or economic patterns grew in that time, that's how the water system was added. It might not be the most logical way to do it if you were doing it from scratch right now. And so we have the question of how do we make that reliable over time? People can argue, it would take the whole panel if we had one of the usual arguments about what is sustainability. But it's really, you hope to have a renewable resource that produces a reliable amount of water every year that doesn't harm the environment and is naturally recurring. You hope that's what you have. And so the state project, there's a project to deal with the Delta, and it's dual goals. It's, yes, there's a Delta project, There's habitat restoration, because the other thing is, and I know the member of Brian from the Santa Clara Water Board has heard me say this probably on too many occasions. Also, when Europeans arrived in California, there were 500,000 acres of wetlands in the Delta. There are 31,000 acres now. And that is really reflected in a lot of crashing species. And so the question is can you continue some measure of reliable exports and restore or bring a better ecosystem health in the same time, hand in hand? And so that's why for the first time, yes, there's a proposal for a water project, but that you actually tie exports to ecosystem health, and you have conservation measures. And if you're really successful in conservation measures, you could export at a higher end of the range. If you're not successful, you could do it at a lower end of the range, and you tie them together. But to the subject, the thing about it is that's just one piece of the puzzle. If we don't do things across a whole different set of alternatives, we're not going to have a reliable, resilient water system in California. That means conservation as a way of life, recycling, stormwater capture, storage, restoration of certain watersheds in a way that are good for water quality and good for water storage and good for water movement. Operational efficiency within this system that has grown up over time, different financing methods that don't penalize people and might actually incent them for green infrastructure. You have to do all these things together. And when you talk about what some of them are, I talk frequently about the fact that when I was in the legislature, I was the point person for water conservation. And when I started 11 or 12 years ago, water conservation was generally viewed as that position environmental legislators would have to justify their opposition to dams and anything else that was not viewed as environmental. Over time, I think people understand it is part of the solution. It is not just this thing off to the side. And the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, its service area has grown by roughly 5 million people in the last few decades, and yet they use less water. So they have gotten more efficient to accommodate their growth. And there's so many different ways. I did a whole series of bills on outdoor urban landscape irrigation. There are certain places in the state that don't even measure the use of water by agriculture. So how can you even have a basis for conservation if you're not measuring? In one of those special interest things that make some of us crazy, the plumbing industry at some point had gotten a special carve out to prohibit dual flush toilets, and waterless urinals were not legal in the state building code. So I negotiated a peace treaty that got us there, in addition to the latest low flow toilets. There were bonds for water planning. I did a bill that said you cannot get bonds for water planning unless you have best practices in place for water conservation. We're not going to pay you to plan for new water unless you can demonstrate you're managing the water you have in a good way beforehand. And I also did a bill to do a 20% per capita reduction by 2020 in water consumption. I couldn't get it through. I was one vote short in the Senate. It was the year I was termed out, and next year they essentially took my bill and incorporated it in the water package that was adopted that year. And so conservation has got to be a part of it. We have to do things better. But this building is a model for other places on how it's not just totally about developing new water, and it's not like there is new water. It is really about managing what we have in a more equitable, more efficient way. Recycling, stormwater capture, it's interesting because I did in the legislature the regulations for bond money to help people with stormwater runoff. And our big concern was the health of the bay and the health of the ocean. That you're trying to make sure that stormwater runoff doesn't affect that health. We were not thinking of are we positioning the state in a way that would really assist people if they wish to recycle and store water? And so we are trying to think about how to do that. Storage, which is a euphemism for dams. But the other thing is underground storage is a thing that has come of age as well. And if we had that really heavy year in 2010, we had 800,000 acre feet of water flow into the ocean through the San Francisco Bay above what was needed for the ecosystem and needed to be exported as per contract. If we had a place to put that 800,000 acre feet, it would be evening out where we are now. The one other thing that I think people will read a lot about is the whole issue of groundwater itself. And Santa Clara, a Valley Water District, has always been one of the pioneers in groundwater recharge, storing it there, pulling it out, moving Lexington or water from Lexington and other places to do that. But there's certain places in the state where the overdrafting over historical time is so pronounced that we're seeing real negative consequences. In the Central Valley, there's subsidence where the land is dropping in certain places. In certain coastal areas, it's being overdrafted, so there's seawater intrusion in the underground aquifer. In some places, northern San Luis Obispo is in crisis now. There have been so many vineyards put in with the expectation that the aquifer could support everybody that's on it, that some people with residential wells that have been there for many decades are going dry because the groundwater table is dropping. And regulating groundwater has been one of the most explosive issues in California. They have groundwater. And historically, in the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, you don't get water from the state project. You have a drought, you overpump. You pump much more than is sustainable out of there. And the question is, on the topic of the day, how do you get to some sustainable way to deal with groundwater in the state? And I think the way maybe to get around that, the explosive politics, is to say the state will give the guidance, the state will give the regulations, but the locals will implement. So even though the direction might come from outside, the decision-making is there. And I don't know if it's going to happen. This might be a year in the legislature, particularly with the drought and overdrafting as a background, where people talk about that. So the big question is how do we sort of bring people along with the heightened awareness in taking long-term steps to water sustainability in California? How do we not use this as a political fight where it's like if people have had a long-standing agenda that they don't like the Endangered Species Act, aha, a drought, let's repeal it because it divides water. It's like, no, it's how do we really try to balance all those interests in California for a sustainable future that includes all these things. And that's why almost everything I mentioned is in a water action plan that the administration has issued with 3 authors, myself, the Secretary of EPA, the Secretary of Agriculture. We together came and authored the Water Action Plan. You can see it online. And as opposed to our 34,000-page environmental impact report and draft on the Delta, it is, I think, 19 or 20 pages. We want it to be readable, clear, have people understand what the steps are that you have to take. So I really am grateful for the fact that you wanted to hear substantively about this. And I'm glad there's speakers from different perspectives, and I will really look forward to the question and discussion period to take it wherever you want it to go at that point. So thanks for having me.